What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about rookies. We're going to be talking about the draft, and we're going to be talking about signing those rookies to contracts to make sure that they will end up on your roster. We're also going to talk about when they actually show up on your roster and how to avoid them not showing up on your roster. So we're going to go ahead and detail the entire process from draft day forward, and we're going to start, like I said, with draft day. So right now, we just started up a fresh franchise, and what I'm going to do is simulate quickly to the draft day. We're going to talk about when that is and move on from there. So we've gone ahead and we've simulated through the months of April and May, and the draft is going to happen at the beginning of June. It's going to happen on June 1st, and so you'll see that I'm going to go ahead and advance here to the draft. You'll see that the draft is actually scheduled for June 2nd. So it's going to happen around that June 1st, June 2nd time frame that you got to be aware that the draft is there. So you're going to want to make sure that you have your scouting and everything in order. So for today's purposes, I'm going to go ahead and simulate this draft so that we get a class of drafted rookies. And you can see whenever I go to the calendar, it has simulated through June 1st, and we are sitting on June 2nd. So it's after any games on June 1st and before any games on June 2nd. So it's like kind of in between those two. But you will see I now have a tab to sign my draft picks, and it's going to come up with all of the draft picks that I have available to me within the franchise. Now, there's a couple of things that are going to happen here. You're going to be able to sign these players, but you have to keep track of who you're going to want to have on your roster, because in order to retain these players and in order for them to show up on the roster, you have to actively sign them to a rookie contract. Otherwise, they will drop into the free agency pool. If I go ahead and back out of here, you will actually see at the bottom of that tab, relatively in the middle of the screen, it says you will lose draft picks to free agency if they are not signed by the end of the regular season. So one of the things that tends to happen with newer players to MLB The Show is that they tend not to realize that you're going to have to sign these players to a contract. It works a little bit differently for baseball here, because you have the option to sign them to a contract, and the player has the option to sign a contract or not sign a contract. If I went in to David Nunez, for example, and I offered him way less money than he was asking for, he can deny that contract. You actually have to work out a contract with these rookies to get them to come onto your team. Once you have actively signed them to a contract, which is a very simple process here, it's going to show up differently in that contract column. You can see here that I have negotiated contracts with 4 out of these 7 players. You can see that the only ones that I have not negotiated a contract with still say none under that contract column. Now again, where MLB The Show differs between itself and many other sports titles is that when you draft a player, number one, they are not automatically going to be signed to a contract for you, and number two, you have the option to determine whether you want to keep these players or not. And number three, these players are not going to immediately be added to your roster. So whereas the draft for the NFL, for example, happens prior to the season and those players then get added to the roster, that is not the case for MLB The Show. What's going to happen is you're going to draft these guys at the beginning of June, and they will not add to your roster until the season is over. One quick note that I want to add as I am simulating to the end of the season is that this is a little bit different of a mechanic than some of the other mechanics that pop up to you, such as contract extensions. While those are only available during certain times of the year, I am actually always able to go up to the top of the screen, go to the handshake button, and sign draft picks from here. So you will have opportunities in order to sign these players if you change your mind. Now, you will not be able to back out of any of these contracts, but let's say I go through a certain amount of the season and I realize, oh, maybe I'm not as deep at this position as I wanted to be. I can then go back to my draft class and choose to sign one of those players. So if you guys will remember correctly, our top drafted prospect was closing pitcher Dave Nunez. We can see that he has now appeared on our roster, but where are we in a time frame here? We have officially advanced to the off offseason, and we have done absolutely nothing with the offseason yet. You can see that we are just sitting in the first phase of offseason. We have not even gotten to free agency 1 phase yet. At this point, however, we will no longer have any opportunity to sign those draft picks that we did not decide to sign prior. So you have to make sure that you make those decisions before the end of the regular season, before you head to the offseason. You will not get an opportunity to sign those players exclusively to your team. However, you may recognize that from our draft class, we decided not to sign catchers Elmo Collado or Ray Ullman to our team. We decided not to sign them to a rookie contract, and whenever I go to the free agency poll, you can see that these players are available. So this is exactly what happens and how these players end up on your roster or not on your roster. And again, this is where some confusion can come into play, especially with those that don't know about the system or are unfamiliar with the way that MLB The Show works or the MLB works with the draft and everything like this. If you do not pay attention to signing these rookies, they will all drop to free agency. And very often, actually, you will end up with a lot of unsigned draft picks from other teams that become available in off-season free agency. And something certainly worth your attention to scroll through the bottom levels, even the mid-levels and high levels worth of players that are available in off-season free agency, because the CPU doesn't always do a great job of re-signing their players, or signing, I should say, their draft picks after the draft. And so you'll see a lot of players such as this, Chad David, and a potential 42 overall player. Now again, he's probably not the best prospect in the world, but I could spend some time going through here and identifying multiple prospects that were draft picks that just simply weren't signed, that are potentially even better than this player. In fact, here's a 53 overall, a potential rookie third baseman, and I also identified at the shortstop position a 55 overall, I think 19 years old he is, B potential shortstop. So you can find various young players here that escaped through that drafting phase and not being signed by their teams, and you certainly don't want to allow this to become you, because if you have a lot of really good draft picks or players that you certainly want to see on your roster in the future, you just have to be aware that you need to sign them to a contract first and foremost, and they will not appear on your roster until the offseason comes around. And that is, like I said, where some of the confusion comes into play. Now, the other factor that can come into play here, which can very much affect how your offseason goes, how your roster is managed, and things of that nature, is how many draft picks you sign to the team and how many players you re-sign to your team for that offseason. Because you have to think about it. For example, we had 7 draft picks. If I signed all 7 of those draft picks, I have to be able to fit them on my roster. Otherwise, we're going to have to make sacrifices for other roster positions. If you always take a look at the top right-hand corner, you will see that breakdown between MLB, AAA, AA, single A. You'll get those totals, 28, 26, 26, and so on. And you're always going to have a breakdown and a max on how many players you can actually have in the organization. And that max is 26, 26, 26, and 15 for the regular season, which is a grand total of 93 players that you can have within your organization. Not necessarily realistic. You can have far more than that in real life between the various different levels of single A and things like that. But nonetheless, you have a cap of 93 players. And so if you sign all of your draft picks and re-sign everybody else to your team, you can have a conflict where you have too many players on the roster, and you're not going to be able to add any free agents, for example, and you're not going to be able to add anybody to your roster until you figure that aspect out and you alleviate some of that max cap on your roster because of increasing too many players with your draft picks and things of that nature. Ultimately, I just wanted to throw that tidbit of information into the end because, again, that's where things can get a little bit crazy, because you can extend your players, their contracts, and re-sign people before those draft picks ever appear on your roster. So let's say you re-sign your entire roster and it's already full, then you're going to go over your roster space when those draft picks come in. It's just something that you need to be aware of because of the order of operations here, with the drafted players being added to your roster last after any contract extensions are potentially taking place during spring training or the regular season. Nonetheless, I hope that this information was useful or valuable to you in some way, and if it was, leave that like down below, comment down below as well, and subscribe. I'll see you guys as always in the next video, and I hope you guys have a good one.